Recording in progress.
All right, everybody. Life Unraveled podcast here. Going to be sitting down with Steve Hiscoe. Is this how you pronounce your last name? Correct?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Well, so we've had a Sambo Steve on the podcast, Stephen Kofer, but not a Sensei Steve. So excited. I kept thinking about that for some reason. I'm like, yes, Steve, Sambo Steve. We've had a couple of Steves, but I really do appreciate you taking the time. So I've had Ari on the podcast, I think 3 times, for different reasons. Man, I grew up in jiu-jitsu, being a white belt. Ari was like the first dude I ever watched do jiu-jitsu, like in an instructional format, And I remember also, like, first time I talked to him on the podcast, and he would show what was Japanese jiu-jitsu, and like I would see, it's like, oh, are these, I've seen some of these terms, in Aikido. I wasn't really at the time, and even on through my colored belts, sure, what his background was, and then heard that he did Japanese jiu-jitsu, and started following more. Told you before we set up this podcast that Keith Owen had been on, and got to talking with Ari about his Japanese jiu-jitsu background. I have an instructor that's 5th degree in our state. And he's done some Japanese jiu-jitsu, and man, I just honestly thought about having you on the podcast, talking to you about this topic probably 20 times. So I had to reach out.
No, my pleasure being here. Yeah.
Yeah. So well, man, let's get right in. I've got some questions. I mean, I would say in my state, Arkansas, that's where we're from, Southern United States. My instructor, it was the first jiu-jitsu black belt in Arkansas. I think in 01, he got his jiu-jitsu way before I started training. I started training in 06, got his black belt. But then, he had done Japanese jiu-jitsu for a long time. But, man, he's like the only guy around me that I knew that did Japanese jiu-jitsu in any form, And I've met more people over the years going to trade shows and conferences and camps. But how did you get into Japanese jiu-jitsu? Like, what could you tell somebody about it that was maybe in my shoes that didn't? I only knew what my instructor was doing,
So I started in 1975. I was 7 years old, and I come home from school, complaining to my parents that maybe I got pushed around a little bit many times. And there was a jiu-jitsu school in Ottawa is where I grew up. So they brought me there, and that was on the 29th of November, 1975. So I just started my 48th year in Japanese jiu-jitsu. The name of our style is Can-Ryu Jiu-Jitsu, which is a Canadian system of jiu-jitsu. The founder is a gentleman by the name of George Sylvain. He was a military police officer, and when he retired from the military, he started teaching at the Algonquin College in the Ottawa area in a law and security program for college kids that wanted to get into policing. And so he was a black belt in karate. He was a brown belt in judo, and had did some boxing and military combatives. And he kind of put this system together in the 60s and called it Can-Ryu, so Canadian style of jiu-jitsu.
Yeah, that's one thing. So I, for 4 years, taught history at a college. I have a master's degree in history. Fascinated by the topic, but man, I will say, so many people in my research fit this kind of mold. I've trained with Bill Superfoot Wallace. Had all this military experience, and a little different route. But then you see a lot of people like Ari, and I believe I've seen yourself too, like the law enforcement side. getting into some of that. One of our instructors here is the chief of police, and but he's a judo and aikido guy, and like some of his older instructors, come from this military background of this post World War II, but really you say more like post Korean War era. But they were stationed in places like Okinawa or Japan in the post war years. And I mean, it's interesting how, as a historian, for me, how some of those cross cultural connections, like how you get Japanese jiu-jitsu in Canada. That's
Right. Yeah. Yeah. For us, it was, came through a judo kind of background. And then, like I said, with the military combatives, and he put this system together. So that's where I started. Like I said, I was 7 years old. Didn't really know where, obviously, when you're a kid, where it's going to take you. But my father joined the dojo a couple of years after I had started. So he was, one of those parents that would drop the kids off and stick around and watch. And eventually was like, you know what? I want to give this a try. And so he did. And we just kind of stuck with it. We got our black belts at the same time in 1983. We got our 5th degree black belt at the same time. And he operated a school in the Ottawa area. And I had moved out close to the Vancouver, British Columbia area in '89 when I joined the RCMP, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And I've operated out here since that time, so close to 30 years. I've had my school here in British Columbia for about 30 years.
so funny observation. I added you on Facebook. I don't know, a year or so ago, probably. But I see you posting all the time at the fitness center. You're like you're working out. You're on the bench. You're doing dumbbells or something. Uh, I myself also have a fitness center membership. I did not go today. Schedule got busier than I thought it was going to. But one thing that's interesting to me, like why I remark on that, is when I tell people I work out at the fitness center because I own a gym, they're like, that makes no sense. But man, the longer I do martial arts, and I get plenty of activity here at the gym, but the longer I do martial arts, and the older I'm getting, I'm 35. It's not like I'm aging out too bad. But man, I just find like the little things like walking and stretching and strength and conditioning are so much more imperative. But also, I think because of my age, I have a lot of students that are a little younger than me, fewer, I would say, that are older. But it's weird. So many people come to the gym for martial arts, and that's kind of their fitness. So it's like a disconnect. So when I see another martial arts guy working out, I'm like, oh, good job.
For me, I started probably in 2015, really kind of going to the gym. I had broken an ankle. I was a little bit heavier at the time. And I just thought, you know what, it's time to kind of switch this around a little bit and look after my own fitness. Teaching is not really training. So I teach about 17, 18 hours a week with the structure of our school. So I get a lot of teaching time, but I don't get a lot of my own personal training mat time. So getting up early, I still have a young son. I've got a 25, 19, and a 10-year-old, and I want to be around for a long time. And I'm going to be 55 this year. And I just thought, you know what, I need to do something for myself. Never been a gym guy. I had a couple of guys that I worked out with in the morning. They have moved on and transferred from where we work. So now it's getting up, the mental challenge of getting out of bed in the morning and getting it done. So that perseverance and consistency.
Yeah, no, just building it into the routine. I was about, I'll tell you, it was before the pandemic, but I was about 30, 31, and I got bronchitis real bad. And I got over it, and then it came back. Like it's like I didn't kick it all the way, and it came back, and then it was a little worse. Maybe even a touch of pneumonia. Like I got it under control, but man, it's just like a mortalizing experience. I remember laying in bed, and I could not breathe. and it scared me. Like I was having a little panic, and it just it's kind of like what you're saying. My wife and I have been we're in family planning stages, but haven't had kids yet, and are trying. But that seems to be a big shift for a lot of people is family. But for me, I mean, I was just like, man, I'm 30. I want to have a full life ahead, and I'm not. It was at a point I'd stopped competing. I competed a lot in jiu-jitsu through my card belts, but I'd not been competing the last couple of years. I wasn't terribly out of shape either, but just got a touch of being really sick, man, and it made me want to really turn things around and start. Every time before that, the only time I went to the fitness center was to get ready for a fight or something,
Right.
It was not like for wellness. It was just like I had a shift to exercise for wellness. So, and my
Yeah,
back was hurting too.
absolutely. Right. And I mean, with students, you want to, show them a good example and be a role model and whatnot. So, it starts at home, and same thing, being a role model for my kids and showing them that fitness is important. And so that's kind of why I do it. And really, the only reason I get up at 4:30 in the morning is because that's the only time I have to myself to be able to kind of get out there and get it done. So,
No, that's the same exact routine for me. I'm not teaching college anymore. It's my first semester not doing that in the last 4 or 5 years. But man, when I was making that transition when I just started teaching full time at a college and running this gym, 450 students now. We probably had around 350 or so then at that time. But it's just like, oh well, I don't have time to work out. Yeah, I was
yeah.
literally just became aware that I was making the same excuses everybody else was, and the same reasons what you said too is like, oh, I'm a martial arts instructor. Like, I was like, it wasn't like I was getting terribly out of shape, but man, like I had old injuries and they would flare up, and I've had way less of that. Like there's a period of 2 or 3 years there, and then like right on the tail end of competing, where I was like always jacked up, and I've just had less of that. So it's definitely been a benefit for my life.
Yeah.
Yeah. So you know, let's just how did you come into contact with Ari, right? So like that's the only reason I know who you are. The only reason I know who Keith Owen is, who went on to be a big inspiration to me. Like I remember Keith gave me my entry report form. I remember messaging him just out of the blue and saying I need this entry report form, and then he called me and was like, "Dude, why you need this? Like, how can I help you? Like with this,
Right.
questions you got." It's just like, man, it was just a really cool thing. And then like he followed up with me like later too, was like, "Hey, how'd that turn out?" But I just like I remember seeing on Ari's page Keith showing stuff, and then I know you also trained with Keith, if my research is correct, and
Yep.
but just some really cool connections there, man. Like, how did all that come to be?
So, probably in the mid 90s, Ari lives over in Victoria, which is just across I'd say across the channel, or he's on Vancouver Island, so not too far away. And I had started a provincial organization here in British Columbia for jiu-jitsu, and mostly Japanese jiu-jitsu at the time, because Brazilian jiu-jitsu wasn't sort of a big deal back in the mid 90s here in British Columbia anyways. And the idea was just to get like-minded jiu-jitsu people together, for people who maybe didn't have an avenue for advancement. And there wasn't a lot of Japanese jiu-jitsu in BC at the time. And Ari was one of those guys on the island. And eventually we kind of connected. He came over, and we just kind of, met up that way. And once the organization kind of dissolved, because we all had other organizations that we belonged to as well, we just kind of kept our friendship. And when he started with the Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, and mostly when he got involved with Keith Owen, that's where I kind of sort of jumped into the Brazilian Jiu Jitsu. That would have been about 8, 9 years ago, I guess. Um, because I was just kind of into my own Japanese Jiu Jitsu or Can-Ryu Jiu-Jitsu at the time. So I decided to get into the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu more to kind of just expand my own knowledge, add some information to my school, be able to provide something a little bit different to my students as well. And that's when I met Keith through Ari and sort of joined up with Team Rhino at that time.
Yeah, that's yeah, cool. I remember too, like I was the first video I saw of Keith was like he's showing a side mount escape. He was talking about punching the person in the face to get the cross face. Like it's just like the way he communicated. I mean, I was like a blue belt at the time, you know, but like, man, there was just such even at that time such a limited amount of information on YouTube. I mean, I remember even when I wrote my master's thesis on um, uh, martial arts being a continually reinvented tradition, but really, I dealt with like Cold War era differences between Eastern and Western societies and how they use martial arts for military traditions and sport and but it's I just like I've seen the change. It's almost like the amount of information for jujitsu or just martial arts in general has gone from like dial up to artificial intelligence level.
Right.
Just like my modem used to make these funny sounds, and now like bam, Keith Owens on my phone in my living room this morning, and I just like Ari's just kind of always a standout to me, just because man, it's my infancy, like core memories of some of the first jujitsu I ever saw, or like you knew everybody that was watching jujitsu was like watching his stuff too.
Yeah.
Like the first viral guy. Um, but man, that is like one thing as I was coming up, and I don't think I ever really answered the question for myself. Just kind of came to just a different way of understanding things, really. But with Japanese jiu-jitsu, like early on, I was always looking at it through the lens of history first, like, and then too, like trying to compare it to what I was doing. I would go to some camps with my coach, and most of his style, I mean, it's pretty deep, but it's a big focus on hand techniques. But I was always trying, like, well, what's the difference in this and jiu-jitsu, Brazilian jiu-jitsu, or some of this in judo, and I mean, how do you explain that to a lay person or a trained person? Like you're hanging out with people like Keith Owen, who I know did kung fu and was a martial artist, not just a jujitsu guy. I feel like but I don't know. It's just like I've gone through some evolutions of how I think about Japanese jiu-jitsu, and I mean, how do you kind of describe it to people when you talk to them about what?
So the jiu-jitsu that I teach, or the stand-up jiu-jitsu that I teach, when I explain to people, we do a lot of the same karate, kicking, punching, stances, and working on that footwork, hold escapes, bear hugs, chokes, full Nelsons, and we do a lot of the same judo throws, and the catchphrase in our style is kind of blow, throw, blow. Hit them, throw them, hit them again. So how do you get out of the hold? How do you get them on the ground? And then, either wrap them up in a choke or a wrist lock or controlling after throw technique, and then create that distance. So depending on, what the student is looking for, like in a law enforcement context, then you can, control the person after the fact, or from a self-defense context, create that distance and get the heck out of there. And like I said, we do a lot of the same kicking, punching, boxing, striking skills.
How much emphasis on do you guys, and I'm sure quite a bit because most martial arts do, but with Kazushi, like off balancing from holds, like that's one thing that I've seen, and I'm really impressed with. Like I have a shodan in judo, but like man, Kazushi's not the easiest for everybody to understand, and there's so many. I mean, it's really just 8 directions, I guess, but the lifting, the pulling, the corners, and the timing. But what would you say about Kazushi for your style of Japanese
For our
jiu-jitsu?
style, um, depending on what the techniques are, I would sort of say our style is more gross motor skills. Like I said, hit, throw, hit, create that distance. Ari and I have another friend. His name is Michael Seamark, and he does Japanese jiu-jitsu, but very traditional Japanese jiu-jitsu. And so really focusing a lot more on the Kazushi and breaking balance and, all the fine motor points of sort of Japanese jiu-jitsu, where I would say ours is maybe a little bit more, like I said, gross motor skills is more, get them on the ground and then go from there. So
You know, um, one thing that's interesting about that, like just how I would say probably, I mean, there's on my research, a lot of different schools within the umbrella of Japanese jiu-jitsu, but and then I've a lot of them focus on stand up. You'll have obviously some grappling, some more so on striking, some more so on joint locking, just based off surface research and talking to people. But what is also interesting, you look at like two of like martial artists from like your instructor's era, Bill Wallace and Joe Lewis. Those dudes came out of the same dojo in Okinawa, right? But they went on. I mean, I've got to be testing for my second degree with Bill in June, and did not get to train with Joe, but my coach is like an eighth degree black belt under Joe Lewis. Trained with him his whole life, pretty much. But and I know a lot about Joe's system from my coach, but like Joe and Bill, even coming from the same system, the same style, the same dojo, at two different times, and then they went on to be best friends later. They have completely different styles, and that's it's always stood out to me because that's one of the things like I think I've evolved my thinking on is like, oh, Japanese jiu-jitsu, it must, it's all the same. Yeah.
I think even I look at my dad's sort of not interpretation, but how he did his jujitsu, and even though we're teaching the same style, he's well, he just retired last year, but he taught until he was 77, 76 years old. He's a bigger man, so not a lot of throws, but a lot more takedowns and wrist locks, and whereas I still, use the throws and add them into our, arsenal type of thing. So I think a lot of times, just depending on what your body can do, you're gonna adapt or, you know, move around.
Yeah, no, that's well, and I think everything we've talked about also, striking, throws, wrist locks, in one form or another, it's all even in like Kodokan Judo. Like you look at Kodokan Judo, like, but what's funny is I've never been to a judo class where we did any striking. You know what I'm saying? At all, not one time.
Yeah.
Um, but that's also what I've had kickboxing fights, MMA fights. We have a boxing club. Like I've very much started doing MMA and Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, but have like tried to branch out into other martial arts, Japanese jiu-jitsu, aikido, karate, taekwondo, anything I can get a Bill Wallace, it's karate system technically, but anything I can kind of expand my viewpoint on striking. It's like, oh, well, judo's got striking. Oh, Japanese jiu-jitsu's got striking. And it's also interesting to me. Like my original judo instructor, like what you're saying. He was a Green Beret in the '60s with the South American bunch, but he got a karate black belt while he was in the Special Forces. But that was one thing that really got me interested in some of this stuff for history and the military tradition side. Just how we value in some societies martial arts being at the forefront of not person self-defense of the citizenry as much as like, okay, we're going to teach our military units. We see the value in this, but you see a lot of pairing with judo and karate or Japanese jiu-jitsu and karate for, I guess just striking and grappling. I'm not just kind of in my observation there. Did you have you done anything other than Japanese jiu-jitsu and Brazilian jiu-jitsu martial
So
arts?
I did karate up to brown belt. When I first moved out to British Columbia, like I said, there was no jiu-jitsu around, so I didn't join anybody else's jiu-jitsu club. Um, there was a karate club, a local karate club, so I went there. The guys were super awesome, and we started cross training. So I was doing karate, and they were doing jiu-jitsu with me. And as things moved along, I had more non-karate people coming to do jiu-jitsu, and then I just kind of stayed with the jiu-jitsu side, and that's how my school started. But besides doing karate, I did a little bit of taekwondo, but that's been about it. So
Let me ask you this. One thing that's fascinating talking, like, I mean, you were talking about, I think you maybe said you opened your school. When did you say you opened your school? 85?
1992.
92. Okay, so I was 5 years old. Right, whatever you said. You were talking about some stuff before I was born. I was born in 87. But that's valuable to me as a martial arts guy, but a historian too, is like you've been through, like I was talking about the dial-up to the AI aspect. You've been through some significant cultural changes in martial arts. Like from the first UFC. What was that? 93. So you're in martial arts. UFC comes in, then an explosion. You get to the Forrest Griffin, Stephen Bonner, rest in peace era, right? Where Spike, and then you go to Fox, and then you go to ESPN, and now it's like a pastime, right? It's like a national sport. But then you get this popularity of jiu-jitsu. What was it like being a Japanese jiu-jitsu guy going through like all of those cultural changes? Because I have seen, just in my limited experience, and have not been focused on not being that way myself, but like, say, I mean, you get a jiu-jitsu guy that's like a Brazilian jiu-jitsu guy, let me clarify, right? That's like, Japanese jiu-jitsu doesn't work. It's I've heard that, I've seen it, but I'm also like, oh, hey coach, when's your Japanese jiu-jitsu camp? I'll be there. Like, I've sought it out, but I do see these stereotypes and have never really got to talk with anybody about them. Like, have you seen some of that?
Yeah, I think I've been doing camps for quite some time, and I have friends that are doing BJJ and things like that. And my experience is that, well, one, moving to British Columbia, there wasn't a lot of Japanese jiu-jitsu to begin with. So when Brazilian jiu-jitsu came along, there were a lot of Brazilian jiu-jitsu schools. That was kind of, the thing. But I had a fairly good reputation in our town, and our school, survived and grew. But yeah, there is, like I said, having camps and stuff, and just found that, if you're a BJJ guy, you didn't go to Japanese jiu-jitsu camps, or you didn't, train on that side or whatnot. It seemed to be, maybe one-sided. Like, we would go and do BJJ seminars or things like that, but it was never, the other way around. And I think that's changing a little bit. And thanks to guys like Ari, where it's just jujitsu, right? There's
I know I
no,
had to clarify a second ago, right? Like, I'm that camp. Like, I was like, oh, I mean Brazilian jiu-jitsu.
yeah,
Okay. Yeah, I mean, even like in my research, like, oh man, it was, judo had been established for a minute before anybody called it anything other than Kano Jiu-Jitsu. Everybody called it Kano Jiu-Jitsu. That was like the first 10 years of the art.
right.
That was the only way it was referred to. And like, I remember when I was writing my thesis chair, Dr. Dykema was like, you're going to have to insert a couple of pages to really delineate out pre-judo jiu-jitsu. I had a chapter on just Japanese jiu-jitsu, judo, and then that diffusing out, right? And he's like, you're gonna like all the different spellings when it started coming to the United States. It's spelled Jiu-Jitsu. Like he's going, and he's like,
Yeah.
but then here it only seems to be spelled this way before this time. But I had to work in like a few pages about just the linguistics of what we're talking about, and when it did start to westernize, and what that was like for the, and the confusions really, because I mean, he was reading it as a historian, and he was kind of confused about all of it. It's like why I had to clarify.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely been a great influence for myself. And, I was, I don't know, at eighth degree black belt when I started doing BJJ as a white belt. And, um, and I got no problem with that. I had no problem putting a white belt on and getting on the mat. And even though I'd been doing, jujitsu for close to 40 years at the time, there was no ego. It was about learning and learning something new and meeting new people and, learning from them. So, for me, it was just about really expanding my own knowledge. And since that time, and, with Ari, and, I know other people who have done the same thing, and Japanese jiu-jitsu guys that are doing BJJ, and now it's, trying to bring them both together. So how, for myself, is how can I integrate the BJJ into my Japanese jiu-jitsu and have it kind of seamless a little bit. So when we're talking about, those after throw techniques or after throw controls and things like that, is how can I flow the BJJ techniques into those pieces of my Japanese jiu-jitsu.
Well, yeah, I'll say, I was talking about stereotypes, but like one thing that drew me to like to study other arts was like, well, I'm hearing about these stereotypes like BJJ guys suck at takedowns. And damn it, I was one of those guys when I heard about it. But like I would hear and see things like that, and then I would look over here and see Ari doing these sick wrist throws and stuff, or just like judo techniques, or you're looking at, I mean, an Aikido or whatever. Hickson Gracie has an Aikido and a judo black belt, you know, and I would see these things, and I'm like, oh well, these places have the takedowns. Obviously, these articles say that the jiu-jitsu guys on the takedowns, and damn it, everybody I was talking to had like a crappy single and double in like 2007, and it was like, oh man, I just talked to this high school wrestler who said not to do that. Like we didn't have high school wrestling even when they sanctioned that in my state in 2009. I started training in 06. So I started branching out into other martial arts. You said a term I've only ever heard my coach say too a minute ago. You said stand-up jiu-jitsu, right? Just talking about like, yeah, we start from standing, but the biggest stereotype in jiu-jitsu is like, I'm gonna sit down and start on our knees, slap bump, and we're just already there, and you do lose an element of realism. Like when you're talking about the grabs and the holds and in the striking too, it's like, yeah, you mean like, oh, things that will help a jiu-jitsu guy, Brazilian jiu-jitsu guy, be able to defend himself.
I mean, I remember going and watching Ari's black belt test, and that he did with Keith Owen, and probably 90% of it was Japanese jiu-jitsu. It was stand-up jiu-jitsu, right? So I think you expect to go see a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt grading, and it's going to be all ground. But 90% of it was stand-up stuff. Mm-hmm. So that was really, cool to see. And I think where that aspect of it's just jiu-jitsu, right? Doesn't matter if it's on the ground or standing up, it's jiu-jitsu.
Or American jiu-jitsu or Japanese jiu-jitsu or Brazilian jiu-jitsu. Like, because that's another big argument. Like,
right.
The Daisy Fresh guys. And we'll put whatever you want on your matted wall. I will do the same. But it's like, oh, American jiu-jitsu. And I've even heard like the Ribeiro brothers, who are Brazilian, be like, oh, well, this stuff's going over here in California right now. This is American jiu-jitsu. I heard them say it. But those just seem to be arguments that, what is that doing for the progress of what we're talking about? Like it's I don't know. A lot of these stereotypes, I think, come from like a place of ego in a negative sense, or squabbling, or trying to be better than one martial art, like almost like that. it's almost like that original thesis of the UFC kind of permeated in the culture, like, oh, my martial arts are better than yours. But it's really like, oh man, like synthesis. That's the best thing for me. It's like if I could synthesize everything that I'm doing, and with all of these styles, that would be a better product, I would think. And I mean, you were talking about that earlier.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, for me, it's being able to provide the service to my students and having the best, not the best martial art, but just the best product that I can provide my students with. So, if we only focus on one aspect, then they're missing out on a whole other aspect. And I think if you're talking about being able to defend yourself, you got to be able to defend yourself standing. You got to be able to defend yourself on the ground, wherever striking. So how do you build kind of something that is, going to be a good product for, your students? And to me, that's, the end goal is to provide the best product to my students as possible.
Mm-hmm. No, that is it. And I even have been like when I was coming up through the colored belts in Brazilian Jiu Jitsu, like I was competing a lot in Jiu Jitsu. I fought a little bit earlier on, then got into competing in Jiu Jitsu as I was getting into my 20s. And I mean, I stayed with that. I was doing MMA and striking, but man, so many of my students do one or the other. Some do both, but it's, I look at that and I'm like, well, I want you to be able to defend yourself, but you only want to learn how to fight these trained people grabbing your gi lapel, right? Like I cannot even give away a striking class to you, or I can't, or whatever, the vice versa. Like my kickboxers that do disc striking, I'm like, I hope you guys don't get taken down. And trying to teach a class to people that's like, okay, I know some of y'all are here for fitness, but also you in your minds, you're here for some self-defense. Almost everybody I talk to, but then they'll be kind of one-sided and just want to do kickboxing a couple of times a week and think everything will be okay. And it's just like, yeah, the thing about I think that gets lost in some of the MMA and Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu scene is like, okay, yeah, but what if they don't try to do the knee in the center method to open your guard? Like, what if they're just dropping elbows on your skull?
Right.
And that's like a ground and pound, or you got sucker punched, or like it's two people on you, And I'm not saying Jiu-Jitsu, MMA can't serve as a tool. I think if synthesized in the right way, it could be beneficial, but I do think there's a lot of closed-mindedness or just like a cultural way of looking at things. Like I was pointing this out to this guy's here just before we started podcasting. We're going to pull up a martial arts school on Facebook. I was going to show him this thing this guy was doing for white belt classes, right? And when the category is like, oh yeah, this guy's jiu-jitsu school, and it said martial arts school, right? So there's actually the algorithms do not even acknowledge anything other than martial arts. There is no jiu-jitsu category. There is no judo category. It's martial arts. That's what we do, but my martial arts better than yours. It just like gets into this weird circular dance sometimes, and I think until maybe people get old enough that they stop thinking that way.
Like for me, I'd probably have about 150, 160 students right now. But probably 100 of those are kids.
Mm-hmm.
Right. And a lot of parents don't bring their kids in for the self-defense value of what martial arts are all about. It's all the other byproduct benefits of training. Right. So, at some point, is it which martial art is best? It's, what is the benefit to the parents and the kids and, that are coming in? I think adults can make their own decision on what it is that they're looking for, and kind of like going and buying a car. I want safety. I want a minivan. I want, I got a big family. Don't try and sell them a Corvette. What is it that they're looking for? And what I'm teaching might not be what they're looking for. They might be looking for something totally different, and that's okay. And or what I am teaching is what they're looking for, and that's great as well, right? I you can't be everything to everybody, and I think you got to stay true, to what it is that you're teaching and whatnot. Because I think if you try and be everything to everybody, that's where you're going to get so watered down that now you have no, base to operate from.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Um, so yeah, your school right now sounds like it's doing great. That's 100 kids is awesome. Um, even like I didn't even do kids for when I first got going. Right, first couple years I was just doing adults and had like 40 adults. But a few years in, um, but man, what so was about to be 2023, and our building now is like 8,000 square foot, but that was a doubling of size that we went through 3 weeks before the pandemic began. We literally we remodeled this thing for about 5 weeks. We were crowded and it doubled our space, but then the pandemic sets in and it's like, and I know you guys had different. I talked with Ari about this and Stefan Kesting and just like some different guys from your area. Um, but man, pandemic, uncertain time, shut us down for 6 weeks, and then we were back in mask, and then had some other days where we had to cancel because instructors and change things. But I know you guys, I feel like had a little more stringent regulations than the Southern United States had, or than even our country, the than we had in comparison. What was the pandemic like for your school? Like, what could you tell us about that? What did you go through? Where are you at now?
So we're back to full operations, or what I would say normal operations, I guess. But when the pandemic hit, yeah, we were shut down. I think, like most people, probably, I think we were shut down 2, 3 months. And then social distancing. So how do you do jujitsu with social distancing? So for our jujitsu style, like we said before, we have striking and things like that. So, I'd done a little bit of weapons and karate and things. So, we were able to kind of come back, have our little 2 meter by 2 meter boxes on the mat, and everybody had to stay in their own, squares and no spectators or anything. So we were able to kind of get back on the mat and have our students here. We did a bunch of Facebook Live kind of classes as well. And eventually we were able to kind of get back to it and rebounded really well. We've recuperated everything we lost over the pandemic and then some. So we've bounced back really well.
About how long have you guys been back to where you are now, normal? If that's
What's it been, a year and a half?
okay, yeah. What were some of the? This again, I'm in the United States, and I'm in a part of the United States that, well, I mean, they broke off of the country once, like, which I love going into the Civil War and reminding people that, the reasons that it was fought, because a lot of people have seemed to have forgotten. But what were your regulations like? Like what? Like you own a school. This thing that has never happened really, and in our lifetimes happens. So if you compare it to the Spanish flu before that, like 100 years ago. Uncertainty. You own a school. What are they people telling you to do? Like what were the regulations like 3 months in?
So we, hand washing, masks, social distancing. Normally I have 30 kids on the mat. We were down to 11 because they all had to be in their individual spots. When we were able to have contact, basically it was like, this is your partner and that's the only person you're going to train with until this kind of changes, right? And making sure that you are comfortable with your partner and what their activities outside of the dojo were. And I think we were able to fend, like we didn't have any major COVID cases in our school. We shortened the amount of time the classes were from an hour to 45 minutes so that we could get a cleaning in between, every class. No parents in the school. That was one of the other pieces is, vaccinated and not vaccinated. Being a police officer and, with the RCMP, the other part is, for me is paying attention to rules. Because if I step out and I do something outside of my regular work, so outside of the RCMP, I'm still can be sanctioned. So if I was operating my dojo sort of underground, not paying attention to any of the health restrictions and those kind of things, and something happens, then I'm going to suffer the consequences within my regular job. And I think I had not many, a few parents that didn't understand that and really were challenging in the sense that, you need to think for yourself and not pay attention to these rules and all that kind of stuff. And it was kind of like, you know what? This is just the way it's going to be. It's, one, my school, two, my livelihood, my job that's on the line if something happens. And, unfortunately, that's the way it's going to be. And we have a very good relationship with all of our parents. And I only had grief from maybe one or two, and that was about all.
Yeah, I mean, that was like a component of it is just like, it was like a PR thing, like, you didn't want to do anything to make anybody mad. You were trying to, I mean, we were really trying to do exactly what you're saying, clean between classes, check temperatures, extra sanitizers,
Yeah.
just everything we could do. We even had the gym like professionally disinfected. These people came with these big things, sprayed everything down. Um, and it was just like, but it was a time of uncertainty, but it's like I've thought about it quite a bit. It's like we were in an area. It's like literally the sheriff and all these people were like, "Y'all do what you want. We're not going to do anything, even if the government told us to. We wouldn't." Like that was the sentiment, and it was just kind of like, okay, so that's where the government's at. That's where the local government's at. But then too, you would have citizens that were like, I mean, crucifying people on on Facebook for going to church. No pun intended.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, it was like I saw churches get attacked more than any other entity, and I was sitting back being like, oh man, like we got like as many people showing up as that church, and we stopped doing spectators too. But man, it was just like trying to manage the public perception, let everybody know that yeah, hey, this is how I make like my whole like how I take care of my family and everything. And we put a lot of thought into it. That's all we do every day is try and think about
Yeah.
how we're going to get through this.
We had a dance studio here that just got crucified because they were doing everything they were supposed to be doing, and they had a COVID case go through, and a whole bunch of kids got COVID, and some of the instructors got COVID, and same thing. Facebook just blasted the owner to the point where they don't have a dance studio anymore. They weren't able to sustain through the pandemic. And like you say, but from that public perception and everything, right?
Well, hats off to us for being able to. I talked to somebody at Century, and they said this, and I've heard this from a few people, and I'm like, okay, well, where's your data? But I've heard 30 and 40% numerous times, numerous places about the number. If you said the percentage of the martial arts industry that is no longer, like they closed, and you got to think like how many people are running an academy that they have a 40-hour week job, and it's not their livelihood, probably not even, they're just paying the rent on the space and they get to train, and it's happy for everybody. But then you hit
Yeah.
a major irregularity like that, and it's like it's over for those people. Yeah.
Absolutely. We've had a couple here in Chilliwack and a couple of my own students because I have um, students that operate schools in other parts of Canada and whatnot, and they've had to shut down. So yeah, it was, difficult in some communities.
Yeah. So like you mentioned with your job, a couple of questions about that. So let's say that was you. You were the dance school owner, like it was your jiu-jitsu school, same thing, a couple instructors got it, whatever. You got it, some of the kids got it. Um, how would your job have handled that? You mentioned being sanctioned. Is that like a fine? Is that hey, will you
Yeah,
suspend
so
someone?
they have what's called a code of conduct, and potentially they would have launched an investigation. You know, what is it? How are you operating? Are you operating within the guidelines or within the health guidelines? And if they find that you're operating outside of those guidelines, meaning you're just allowing anybody in and no cleaning and and yeah, it could have been a fine or a couple of days suspension, or it's kind of hard to tell.
Yeah, yeah.
Um,
It's just because it's a new thing, like
yeah,
yeah. Not that's I think what caught everybody is just what do we do? How do we really address the scale of this thing? It's like there were really no contingencies in place for like the government asking you to close your business, and it's a lot of uncertainty. And fortunately, we were, if anything, we stopped doing spectators and still don't. But we don't have the room even with our size. We will run like 2 or 3 classes at once. So like
right.
by the time all those students are in there, we're at occupancy for the most part.
Yeah, we're not allowing any parents in or spectators in right now, either, mostly with the kids' classes. Um, and I just found the other benefit was that the kids pay attention more. Is, they're not distracted by the parents who are chit-chatting or on their phone, or they've got a sibling that is, sitting on the side playing on their iPad or,
Hmm.
with their little Hot Wheels and stuff. And I just find that the kids pay attention a lot more. So that's kind of been a positive outcome to the pandemic.
Yeah, we started. You mentioned doing Zoom classes. We did that in the beginning, but then we got set up with these Mevo live streaming cameras. It came with like a pack of three of them, and we got them hardwired in, and we can live stream the classes now from overhead, and we do that in our member group on Facebook. And now, like, man, the parents are it, that group is so much more engaged. I have about 500 members in the member group, but it's parents. Some of them are former members and stuff. But we went from like we'd post in there, and some people might see it, the adult members. But now all the parents are coming to that group where we stream, and they're commenting on little Johnny's. Oh, and Cora's Matt chat. My wife, she's talking to the kids, and it just the parents are engaging. And now when we share information in there, they see it.
Right.
And and we're sharing that same information on our main social media page or sending out an email. So it gives us a little more coverage. It's been nice in that regard of it's, I think, a byproduct of not having spectators. And but that's something that I mean a lot of gyms in different schools are streaming their classes, but that's definitely a leap we made because of the pandemic.
I think it really forced people to kind of look at their operations and be able to shift and make the best of a bad situation, right? And I know we did kind of the same thing. We're not right now. Um, Obviously, it takes time and effort, and still having a 40-hour a week job and teaching full time. So, but this is my hopefully my last year of work. I've been with the RCMP for 34 years. I start my 35th year on the 3rd of January. So looking to retire at the beginning of 2024, and then it'll just be running the dojo and jiu-jitsu full time after that.
Nice. Yeah, that's man, 35 years, a long time. I'm 35 years old. It's a
There you go.
long time to do something, anything, you know?
Yeah.
Because I mean, you hear like I know so many people that they were in the military for 20 years and then they weren't. Yeah, that was the time that they could retire. 30 years for a teacher is usually the standard bag. And I know for us, you know, you got into your 60s for Social Security or whatever. It just depends on when you were born. But man, that's a lifetime. You know, 35 years is
Yeah.
it's a long time to do anything. So props. So this your full time job is RCMP. Is that what you said?
Yeah. So I work for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. I'm a staff sergeant and I work at our provincial training academy. And my role there is that I look after all our use of force programs and firearms programs. So I have about 60 instructors that report up through myself. And yeah, that's kind of what I
So
look
like
after.
when you say mounted patrol, like you're talking like horseback is that still how they're doing it?
I'm sorry, what was that?
When you say mounted patrol, are you talking like
Oh,
horseback? Like
no, we don't do that anymore.
man, thought you were
Yeah.
like a cavalry officer or something for a
Yeah,
second.
no, no.
But yeah, yeah,
That's
I've seen that in y'all's like what the movie The Untouchables with Kevin Costner. I don't know if you've ever seen it. There's the scene across the bridge at the mounted.
yeah, yeah, the red uniform and the Stetson hat
Yeah,
and yeah, absolutely.
yeah. So, but yeah, I could see probably evolve with the times and not get around on a horseback. Could be. I mean, you could still some of that goes on. I know in like New York City and different like some cities where that's probably high traffic still
Yep,
viable. Um,
yep.
so, and how did you get involved with law enforcement, but particularly with like the role you're in now? That's very interesting with like use of force cases. Is it just your sort of your martial arts expertise kind of made you the right guy for that, or?
So when I was 18, 19 years old, I was teaching at the school that we went to at the time, and one of the fathers was an RCMP member. And so we kind of had that chat that maybe a lot of adults and teens have. What are you going to do with your life, Steve? And I said, well, I'm going to teach jujitsu. And so he asked, if I had any thoughts of ever being a police officer, and went home, talked to my parents about it, and applied, and off we went. And then in 2000, so I got into the RCMP in 1989, and then around 1999, I wanted to do some use of force training with my colleagues, but I needed a certain course. And so I took that called a public and police safety instructor course. So I took the course, and eventually the person that was in charge of training at my department moved along, and I took over his position. So in 2001 is where I went into the training part of my career. And so I was an instructor, and then the Provincial Training Academy was starting up a new use of force program. I knew the person that was looking after it, so I transferred over to that to the academy and moved up through the ranks as an instructor, and then a supervisor and a manager, and now a program manager. And so I've been able to kind of, like you say, put my jujitsu and my policing career together, and love my job. And like I say, the only reason that I retire is because I'm kind of tired of working 16 hours a day.
Yeah, that man, that
But
more than anything is why I got out of teaching college. Like my gym is very successful. I'm not the only person to behind that success. My wife and we have so many great assistants that help. But man, I was getting up early, like what you're saying. I get up at 4, work out, go get a second coffee on my way to the college, which was a 30-minute drive. I would teach and stay there until about 1 o'clock, and then I would come back. And I was so wound up, not from the 2 coffees, partially, but that like man, when I was at the gym before that, I would, go teach morning class, maybe noon class maybe I'd teach twice that day, and then I would take a nap, or I would take a nap after morning or afternoon class before I go in the evening. And man, just like when I started at university, and there was no naps. Like I was just so wound up. I didn't take a nap for like 3 years, and man, it's got to the point where the gym just kept growing and growing and growing. And then we moved to this spot, and then the pandemic happened. But then till we kept growing after the pandemic, and I was just like spending 5.5 hours driving to this place. And I mean, you mentioned how many hours you teach martial arts. It's about similar for me. And I'm like, I can just no longer justify I listen to 100 books a year sitting in the car for that long, but I couldn't justify doing that for, what I was making, or just how like weird, higher education was getting too. Like, our funding model for like the people that want to get loans or high school students that are coming, it's gotten to a point where if you are a professor, it's almost like being a high school teacher was when I decided to not be a high school teacher. It's like, yeah, write your stuff on the board. Here's your syllabus. Teach this, and don't do anything else. And I'm like, well, you guys don't do history. You don't know anything about history, and the people I know that teach history teach it this guy, across the board. And like a lot of that everybody was dropping, enrollments were dropping because of the pandemic, so like the funding model, which was already kind of had been changed, was weird. Just like made for a tense situation in our state. A lot of we've had high schools consolidate in my lifetime, but we're seeing now colleges consolidate across our state and across our region in ways that it's like pretty much, every all of the colleges, or the community colleges lower level, or some of the four-year institutions, are getting bought out by the larger entities. We have two really large colleges that they are 80% of education in the state now.
Wow.
So but a lot of weird stuff with that, man. Just like the gym was, I felt like where through stuff like this and the podcast, I think, feel as much fulfillment, do things I want, and still even do things I want with history through the podcast, which is, it's just like if teaching is viable of a livelihood, is these other things I have going on, I would definitely still do it. But it got to the point where I know a lot of people that have gotten out of education. It's kind of a strange time. So actually, my mentor is a jiu-jitsu black belt, one of our first. He's taught the whole time I knew him, and he got out this last year, moved to Washington, D.C., doesn't teach anymore, taught for 20 years, and just got burned out and does something else now. Moved all the way across the country, man. It's but that's things change. So
I think you gotta keep having fun at what you're doing, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, if I wasn't having fun at work, then I've got enough service that I could have retired, 9 years ago. But I enjoy my job. I have a great job. The guys that I work with, and the dojo, as well. And I think, I've met some guys that have opened schools. It's a huge commitment. And, you don't open a school to teach for a couple of years, right? Like you open a school because it's, something you want to do, and it's going to be a long-term commitment because you have so many people that depend on you, or like students that depend on you, or, they get to be not quite like family, but definitely you have a huge impact on these people's lives. And to just kind of fold it because you don't feel like doing it anymore, I think is a big thing. So,
well, man, too, another thing, Steve, we can kind of wrap it up here, but one thing I do appreciate a lot, and just kind of getting to know more about, is the goal of the podcast, kind of fill in some blanks. But man, we need more people like you like this guy that I mentioned on the podcast with Ari, that's chief of police and one of our Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu brown belts, judo 4th degree, Aikido 6th. He's a lifelong martial artist, you know, and he does law enforcement training, you know, and Ari, like with what he's doing with Invictus, and I mean, I've seen you also actively, you know, moving that narrative along, and I think that it's a very important narrative. You know, my community, we just had defensive tactics training here. So what was it? Last week, like right after Christmas, um, and we try and just be a patron of that stuff because, man, I want more than anything the officers to be able to have some of the stuff that we have, to be able to stay composed, to be able to have something that will help them be maybe a little more in shape, or a method where, you know, hey, I can control this person, I won't have to tase them, or maybe they have to tase them instead of shoot them. You know, just like, man, when you can go hands-on, I just think that that's another level. Like, why would you not want that pillar along with firearms and you know, all the other tools on the belt, you know? And I'm happy to be doing what I do in a time where there's such a strong narrative around the need for that, you know? And I'm you know, again, grateful for people like you and Ari that are much more involved in me. You know, I can kind of host and open my doors, but I'm not involved in law enforcement, and busy enough I probably won't be, but I definitely you know, like I want my gym to be a place, and it is, where those guys come and do their training often.
Yeah, well, no, that's just as important, is to have people that are supportive that way, even if they're not actively involved, is having them supportive on the periphery is, you know, super important as well. So thanks for that.
Yeah. Okay, so you have social media, website, if anybody wants to check you out or give you a follow, YouTube, anything?
Yeah, so I'm on Facebook, Steve Hiscoe. I'm on Instagram, Sensei Hiscoe. I also have our PRTC Police Jiu-Jitsu Club is on there as well. We've got a YouTube channel, Hiscoe Jiu-Jitsu on YouTube. We got a whole bunch of our Can-Ryu techniques and stuff on there as well, if anybody wants to kind of see what we're up to. But yeah, not a hard person to find on social media.
Excellent. Well, Steve, again, thanks for what you're doing. I appreciate your time today. Again, I've been wanting to talk to you for a while, and just finally reached out, and I really am grateful for you taking a minute and making it happen. It's been awesome.
Well, thanks, Brian. I'm super happy to do this and meet you, and look forward to chatting again sometime in the future. And
we'll have to do it again someday, for sure.
Yeah, right on. Have a great day.
You too, man. See ya.